This week on Quadriga, Pope Francis, a year of change. On March 13th, 2013, Argentine Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected the new head of the Catholic Church, the first Latin American Pope.
Fratelli e sorelle, buonasera.
Pope Francis quickly became a symbol of hope that the Vatican was undergoing a fundamental change. The popular, likeable pontiff is seen as representing simplicity and humility, rejecting the luxuries of the church and reaching out to the public. But will the Catholic Church as a whole be able to follow his lead? Or is it too mired in tradition? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. The Pope's first-year anniversary has prompted a wealth of commentary, but a perhaps surprising lack of agreement. Has he really initiated a process of revolutionary change? And can he in future live up to the expectations that this first year has raised? That's what we want to talk about today with three Vatican watchers. It's my pleasure to introduce Derek Scully. He's the Berlin correspondent of the Irish Times. He covers German and European politics and cultural affairs, and he reported closely on Pope Benedict. Martín Gak is originally from Argentina, has a PhD in philosophy, and regularly writes on religion and ethics for a variety of media, including his own blog, The Radical Secularist. And Claudia Keller is an editor at the German-based paper Der Tagesspiegel, where religious affairs is among the areas which she covers. The Pope has attracted almost 7 million visitors to papal events since he has been in office. He recently found himself compelled to remind people that he's not a superstar. What accounts for this absolutely astonishing popularity, Martín Gak?
I think that there is an astonishing contrast between this Pope and whatever we saw for the last, say, 2,000 years. So the history that we hear about the Church, and I think that what we see coming into the limelight, I mean, we can make probably some exceptions for John Paul II, but the contrast between what the Vatican was a year ago and the way we thought about the Vatican a year ago and what we think about the Vatican today, I think accounts for not only the contrast, but sort of the relevance of the figure.
The question is, Claudia Keller, will it really amount to a true revitalization of the Catholic Church? Surveys seem to show that Catholics, for instance, here in Germany or in the US, they're enthusiastic about Pope Francis, but they're not necessarily going to church any more often.
Well, being enthusiastic is the first step, I guess. And I think he has already revitalized the Church. And here, not only his own people, but also secular people, atheistic people are fascinated by him and are willing to listen to him. And I think this is the first step.
What do you think, Derek Scully? Is there really anything more to this than a shift in papal style, so to speak, a kind of a rebranding of this ancient institution?
Well, I think if you were to talk to some mad men, some advertising executives, you'd say if you want to change the content, you have to change the perceptions first. And that's, I think, what we've seen. I mean, he's obviously been thinking about this himself, but yeah, you could also hire in some very expensive advertising executives who would give you the same advice. Change the perception of the brand if the brand is considered a problem, and only then can you actually go in and look at the content of the product itself. And I think that's what we've seen in the last year. And yeah, we are now into the next phase, which is going inside what has been a very problematic brand for the last couple of years.
Martín Gak, our report mentioned his simplicity, his humility. Are those the kind of attributes that are attracting so much enthusiasm and fervor? Or is it actually a hope for true doctrinal change that's making people so interested?
I think that we are not seeing a change in doctrinal content. I think that what we're seeing is a change in doctrinal emphasis. That is to say, we have moved from questions of, say, the prevalence of sexual morality as a central issue in church discussions to questions of social and economic justice. If you think about the state of sort of global economics for the last 10 years, I mean, crisis after crisis, sort of a massive wave of demonstrations, etc. In some way, I think that what I would argue is that this papacy so far has managed to capture a niche in the political market that was not being occupied. And this is the center left and people that feel completely disenfranchised from the usual political structures. I disagree that this is really just a matter of rebranding. I think that we clearly see the rebranding, but I think that there is actually a very definite and very clear change in the direction of the application and emphasis of doctrinal matters on the floor, on the ground.
Claudia Keller, people often tend to seize on remarks like the one that Pope Francis made when he was asked about homosexuality, and he said, well, who am I to judge? Does that mean that there's a lot of hope riding on real doctrinal shift in future?
I think there is a lot of hope, but I don't see that it will be fulfilled, this hope. But why he puts the whole person, the whole human being in the center of his preachings, of his writings, of his saying, and he doesn't start with counting sins and mistakes and saying you can't do that and you should not that. But first, why he uses the metaphor, our first duty is to heal wounds. And then second, we can talk about everything else when the wounds are healed. So this is a real shift.
The kind of change in style that we're seeing, Derek Scully, how much of it, the humility, the simplicity, how much of it has to do with his Jesuit background?
I'm not sure. I think it's more to do with where he's come from. I mean, this is a man who used to go out at night into the slums. I mean, this is the contradiction, the frustration people had in the past. Why are priests telling me in my problematic marriage about marriage? Why is a priest with Prada handmade slippers telling me about poverty? And so this is a man who comes with a different credibility. So I don't think, I mean, he's gone through transformations in his Jesuit background, and there were some questions asked. We were asking questions a year ago, did he perhaps betray some of his brothers in South America? But he seems to have made a shift from a Jesuit to a bishop of the poor, and that seems to have made the transition now to a pope who talks about global issues, global poverty, global challenges. That seems to be more credible, and that seems to be what people are enthusiastic to hear.
Well, Jesuits have been, I mean, the ministry of the poor. So in a sense, I think that, and excellent communicators for, many years. So I think that in a sense it fits this kind of image and profile, no?
I would like to stress what you said, where he doesn't make theological abstractions, but what he says is really full of life and full of experience by himself.
Yes, I think anyone who's been through a Jesuit education would think it's sort of you exist in your mind and you are good at intellectual argument. Are you good at getting your hands dirty? And I think these people have a feeling this Pope is actually somebody who kisses feet of poor people. This is somebody who embraces the sick. You see these images. He's not afraid of
getting in touch.
Of getting in touch, and that has a tremendous effect, particularly in this media age.
So that's the change in approach and style. Let's take a look at changes or potential changes in theology and doctrine, if there are any. Here's a report.
Francis has opened up the Church, appointing cardinals from beyond the borders of Europe, including from some of the world's poorest countries, Haiti, Nicaragua and Burkina Faso. He's issued blistering critiques of capitalism, speaking of an idolatry of money.
The Church, all of us, must strip off our worldly wealth that leads to vanity, pride and idolatry.
As regards the Church, the Pope has appointed a team to revamp the Vatican Bank, which has been accused of money laundering, and has promised more transparency. But despite reforms, Francis holds tight to traditional values. On matters such as contraception, abortion and divorce, he may be as conservative as his predecessor, Benedict XVI. Is the Church undergoing a sea change? Or is it just a change of style?
Martín Gak, both liberals and conservatives like to try to claim Pope Francis as one of their own. I took a look at his Wikipedia page preparing for this discussion. It's definitely been written by the conservatives. What do you think? Where does the truth lie?
I think this is actually just a difficult figure to read. I mean, and of course, the question here depends on what you mean by liberals, what you mean by conservatives. It's very clear that the type of conservatism that we would see in the US, I mean, this sort of neoliberal conservatism most certainly will not look at this man as an ally. As a matter of fact, I mean, you know, most of the very critical voices have come out of those quarters. On the other hand, I mean, you have all these kind of left-wing liberals or progressives of a certain brand, feminists among them, and you know, libertarians and anarchists that really just think that nothing new is happening here, that this is just a rehashing, as Derek put it, with a new brand. So what we have is a repackaging of old and really quite ugly traditions. I think that both of those perceptions are wrong. I mean, I think that in a sense we do have a return to a certain form of gospel and evangelism that is very much at the center of the doctrinal position. So I don't really think that, you know, conservatives have a leg to stand on, to be honest, in the criticism of, for instance, economic positions. But on the other hand, truth be told, is that I do not believe that here we will see a massive change in terms of doctrine, in terms of content. This is not a democracy. This is still a doctrinal system.
Derek Scully, if there is a certain ambiguity here, is that because Pope Francis intentionally cultivates it?
Well, I think so. I mean, he knows he has a role to fulfill, and that role is not to contradict his predecessor. You can't. You cannot just walk in and say, oh, by the way, the previous guy, forget everything he said. I've got some new ideas here. I've got something here in my pocket. He can't do that. The best we can hope with this man is that he can change the structures, change the thinking, open a few windows, let in some air, and then I mean, he's a 77-year-old man with one lung. He's not going to be around forever, but he can perhaps, by not coming out as explicitly doctrinal on certain issues, he has created a freedom of movement, a wriggle room for his successor. And I think that's where we need to think about. Popes do not contradict their predecessors.
I'm sorry, can I say, I think that there is a problem, though, in the way that we're conceiving not only Vatican politics, but politics in general. When you hear the criticism that these are not substantive changes, in the mind of people, politics is something that sort of you do, and then once you're done, it is done. And then you have the reform of the church. How is the church reformed? By reforming it. The fact is that I think that this picture, which is a progressive process by which you change cultures, in which other voices have more space, in which the systems of conversation change, that is actually the reform. And I think that that's something that, perhaps also to answer your previous question, we're actually seeing.
Let's come back to that in a moment, but maybe just take a look at some of the issues that were mentioned in our report, starting with economics and politics. Claudia Keller, certainly this is not the first time that a pope or the church has criticized capitalism. Does Pope Francis really take that critique further?
Well, he has a very clear point of view, saying this economy kills. And he doesn't care about analysis and interpretations. This is here where I stand, and this economy kills. I guess, well, Benedict, in his intellectual way of talking, would not have gone that far. Maybe wanting to say the same, but he didn't find this clear and this clear language. But I would like to stress another point, looking at the people who are divorced and got remarried. He calls in this synod at the end of the year, and well, he is at least open for debates and to change doctrine in this section.
Although is he really? Are you convinced of that? There are certainly voices out there saying, yes, he is supporting a culture of debate, but in the end, things won't change. And of course, the point that is many people hope will change is that divorced Catholics would be admitted to communion, which has not been the case until now.
Changes in the Catholic Church don't go like that. Till yesterday, we did it this way, and from now on we do it in a totally different way. But finding ways to keep the old model and still finding exceptions and looking at the individual person and their needs. And this is how doctrines are changed, not from one moment to the other moment.
I mean, doctrinal positions do change.
Yes.
It is not simply one.
On the other hand, if I look at the Pope's interview with the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, which he just recently gave, Derek Scully, I'd have to conclude I don't see that much willingness to change on some of these critical points. On contraception, for example, he reaffirmed the ban on that, the encyclical. Also, he reiterated the official line that marriage is a union between a man and a woman. So how much can we really expect in this area of family and sexuality?
I have never been and would never be particularly optimistic that there's going to be a revolution. We had a revolution a year ago when the first Pope in 600 years stood down. But yeah, I said last year, I said this year, and I would probably say in a year's time, yeah, the honeymoon period. I mean, the media have a huge role to play in this. You know, what do? You create expectations, you build somebody up, and then after a year you get bored and you start hacking away at them. So I think the second year will be far more interesting than the first year. What do people do when they get used to the style, when they want to see the substance? I really don't see anything there. But perhaps there is perhaps he's decided there is a mass of people who could be won back to the church by just a slightly different style. But people do not really look terribly closely. They look at doctrine, how it affects them, but people are already in the church. As you saw from the recent survey, 90% of Germans said they don't really agree with church teaching on contraception, but these are people who are going to the church, filling in the form and going home. I mean, the contradiction couldn't be greater. So whether or not there will be doctrinal change, questionable. Whether or not it will bother people who are going to the church anyway, also questionable.
Martín Gak, how satisfied were you with what the Pope had to say about the sexual abuse scandal? In some ways it sounded, and indeed the media were critical in this instance, as if he was once again being an apologist for the church, saying, hey, look, we're the only public institution that actually has really come out and tried to work on this, and perhaps not going terribly far in terms of an official apology or soul searching.
Well, I personally was thoroughly dissatisfied. I mean, but completely dissatisfied, and I'd been completely satisfied with the church for the last 12 years of this story. I mean, or the last 6 years in which we actually have had full accounts. Not only this, I mean, the question of the relation with justice and jurisdictions, national jurisdictions and so on was atrocious. The response in the UN was atrocious. It should have never happened, and one would have expected that with a better PR project, they would have done much better. I think that the difference between questions such as, say, sexual minorities and things like the sexual abuse scandal, in this sense, I mean, I beg to disagree with Derek. I think that the point is that insofar as the Pope and the Church is not actually pushing the homophobic agenda, then, and we hear less of that in the parishes, and we hear less of that on the ground. I mean, in churches in Latin America, or in churches in Poland and the Ukraine, or in churches in the Philippines, then the space opens for a sea change. It might be very gradual. It might not represent a revolution, but I think that we actually will see something that maybe it's not doctrinal, but it's still a change. When we're talking about things like sexual abuse, we actually, I think, should expect and demand, as citizens of juridical orders, that in fact justice be served. And the problem that we have here is that this is not only a matter of political changes in the structure and practice of the church. That is fine. We actually have a story of a cover-up that probably has lasted for the better part of the 20th century, if not before. This demands the adjudication of justice. This demands justice. This is not a matter of political options. And in this sense, if the Vatican cannot do it themselves, it is very clear in my mind that European powers and national powers have the duty to demand and push the church.
Claudia Keller, were you also disappointed with what the Pope had to say on sexual abuse?
Yeah, you mentioned this interview by Corriere della Sera, and I found it quite depressing what he said there, that the most abuses happen in families and that we are the only institution that are continually attacked. I mean, yes, he's right, but it really sounds like, we are the poor church and please leave us alone. And I think here,
what accounts for the discrepancy between how he speaks to that subject and the openness that he's shown on other issues?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I don't think you can underestimate the defensiveness. I mean, I'm coming from Ireland. The sexual abuse scandal there has been running for 20 years. That has literally undermined the foundation of the church. And at some point, people in the church stopped listening and they started getting very, very defensive. And I think that probably has permeated right up to the Vatican, that they feel that they cannot get a fair hearing. It doesn't really matter what they do. I think what he was saying, yeah, it's rather unfortunate to say, well, actually most abuse takes place in the family. Like, what about, look over there, you know. Yeah. But we have not got a way of discussing I think child abuse is the issue, and child abuse in the church, abuse of trust in people who are supposed to be immoral, morally are role models for us is terrible, but there isn't a debate about child abuse. Is child abuse the problem? I don't think the child care who's abusing them. I think that's the point he was trying to make there. We need to have a discussion about child abuse, and we can also discuss the church, and the church has been addressing this, and they are just now so defensive. I don't think you can actually have a sensible discussion, particularly not with the media. I don't think. I think the feeling is just that this is just too much hurt in this debate.
And we shouldn't forget about the conservative powers that are still there in the Vatican, like, for example, Genswein, or the chief of the faith congregation, Müller, who always thought, oh, the whole discussion on child abuse is just a media campaign. And while he has to probably balance out the powers there.
But you know, but I think that there is also an interesting caveat to be made, that if, as a matter of fact, there is still a civil war going on inside the Vatican, and there are very strong reasons to believe that, in fact, there are, this is actually an excellent opportunity for the people around Francis to organize a purge. I don't think that a purge could actually happen overnight. I think that certainly the statement to the Corriere della Sera was like, yeah, of course, I beat my wife, but the guy upstairs killed her. So this is obviously not a defense. You judge different crimes. But
then let's talk about the power structures in the church, but let me start with a point that is perhaps the bridge between sex and family issues and those power structures, namely the role of women. Here, too, the Pope has indicated that he wants to see things change, and yet on the other hand, he said, ordination, no, women are not going to be ordained. So what do you think, Claudia Keller? Where are we going on the role of women, and would it make a difference to the church?
Well, I found it very ambiguous what he said ambiguous about women. You're right, and if this is really what he wants to empower the feminine in the Vatican, he should call women into offices, into Vatican ministries. At least, well, there are Catholic women who from the rights, from the clerical right, would be allowed to do that, and I definitely want him to go further there.
Would either of the gentlemen on our panel object to such a change?
No, I don't think so, but I think that we have this contradiction that the more you talk about an issue, the less likely you are probably going to see change, if not by him, by his successor. This is the bizarre attitude of the papacy, that the more people bang on about something. I find it quite positive that he has decided that homosexuality is not the world's biggest problem. Poverty is, the fight against HIV/AIDS is, and I think most people welcome that. And the less you talk about homosexuality, the more wriggle room I think you create later on, perhaps the less there is discussion. So there is a contradiction there. You won't have a debate about the role of women, but the more it's discussed, the more the spotlight is on it, I think the more he is under scrutiny from conservatives and so on.
It seems as if you are all suggesting that the Pope has made one very significant change in the way that the church functions, namely to encourage a multiplicity of viewpoints, to encourage more debate. One thing he's done on the issue of sex and family issues is to send out a questionnaire asking what lay people think about the church's attitudes on these issues. That's quite an interesting new approach. Martín Gak, how far will it take us?
I think it will take us actually very far. I tend to read politics in a slightly different way. I think that the story here is not about what headlines we produce. The story is what happens on the ground and what kind of performances are allowed in the context of the church. Whether women become priests or not, I think that this, to be perfectly honest, is an absolutely irrelevant question. The sense is that this is an institution that has its limits. Now, when you actually go out and sort of try to bring laity and try to bring bishopries into structures of power, and you're clearly showing that this is going to oppose cardinals and curia, et cetera, you're actually setting the grounds for a very different type of performance. So I sort of I would invite you all to think of sort of the Vatican political system, or any other for that matter, as a performance. In a sense, the question here is, how is it that these groups are going to start interacting with others? If the bishops really take central stage, or take more of the central stage, the balance of power will change. And that means that the way in which adjudications and things on the ground get done will actually differ too.
He apparently does want to give more power to the bishops. There are to be 2 decision-making synods of bishops, Claudia Keller, this year and next. They will be taking up sex and family issues. That questionnaire I mentioned will be presented to them. How do you see that changing the way that the church works, and potentially also doctrine, if at all?
Well, I think this is really quite interesting, giving more power to the national bishop conferences. But the national bishop conferences then have to take this power, be courage enough to take this power, and I think this will take a while.
There is a new bishop at the head of the German church now.
Yeah.
He has just been elected. You were covering that change. What will that mean?
Well, he's in the group of the 8 in the Vatican who advises Pope Francis, and he has a very good standing in the Vatican, and he's a very powerful man here in the German church, and I think he is the right man to give church here in Germany a new standing and a new, being heard in society. So I think he's
right.
The right
It's not about giving away power. It's what the people who get the power do with it.
Yeah.
And I think you'll need to watch for 2 things. I mean, what Pope Francis is doing is he's, in one case, there have been synods in the past, but they've met in private, and the Pope has written the report, and people can question the validity of the exercise. In other cases, there have been structures that were created by Vatican II that have never been invoked. So if the Pope sort of opens the possibilities of handing over power to institutions that existed only on paper but were never invoked, or where he had the last word, that is interesting on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's what these people actually do once they have the reins. And I would be very curious about then what will happen, because we see in, let's say, in the church of in the Anglican Church, what happens when you sort of open things up. You can have very lively discussions, just try and bring it to a conclusion, so that could be quite an unruly discussion. And you may see the Pope actually, although he didn't want to, actually trying to come in the end and offer, can we try and come to a consensus here? So that will be interesting.
Not every bishop, not every priest is happy about the new culture of debate. Because it means a lot of insecurity.
Martín Gak, certainly people who aren't happy would be members of the Curia, the group of 8, which Claudia Keller just mentioned, which also includes the German Bishop Mr. Marx. That group has been created by him from 5 different continents to basically look at how to reform the Curia, and it is a very, very controversial job indeed. What do you think? Can they do it?
Well, I mean, can they actually change an entire institutional culture? Again, my answer is it all depends what you mean by change. Can there be a progressive, gradual change of culture which actually ultimately results in the change of the way in which the Vatican performs? Yeah, of course, that can happen. Now, can somebody come in, sit down and say, well, let's just move the boxes around and then everything will work fine? The answer, of course, is not.
But is that all they're doing? They have, after all, already made some very significant alterations to the Vatican Bank, which had been the source of so much corruption.
Yes, but the problem that we still have within the Vatican Bank is that the Vatican Bank still has an internal structure. So what you have now is much stronger oversight. The question is whether that oversight translates into practices. What we do see is that there is a difference from the top-down and bottom-up ways of change. I think that what we have seen with the entry of Francis into the papacy is a very strong commitment to the idea that you can do some things bottom-up. The problem is whether you can do things bottom-up in something that is as recalcitrant as a bureaucracy of the size of the bureaucracy in the Vatican.
I think it's quite true. We could see in the next year that, a bit like Star Wars, the Curia fights back, if that actually happens. But I was speaking to a very high-ranking Irish religious recently. He said the Curia can do what they want now, but what Pope Francis has done is quite simple. He has moved out of the papal palace, and by doing that, the Curia are no longer the gatekeepers to who he sees. They're no longer creating his reality. This was often the problem and the criticism with Pope Benedict, that they were filtering, and they didn't even have internet, I think, at some point. So the fact that he is in this guest house, he decides who he sees, and they have to come and see him, and he can say no to see them. So I think when decisions are finally being made, and the Pope is now out of a reality, a Curia-created reality, and into another reality. So I think, yes, the Curia will probably be very resistant to change, but Pope Francis seems to be trying to create a post-Curia reality, or at least leave behind the reality that they were creating for previous popes. And I think that's, with a simple, he packed his bag, he never even moved into the papal palace and moved into this guest house. I think that's actually quite significant. It cannot be underestimated.
Claudia Killer, that takes us back to the idea of diversity as a force for change, perhaps sometimes even for very subversive change. Do you think the fact that we have a much greater degree of global input also through the G8, do you think that makes a significant difference here?
Sure. And Pope Benedict was said to be a person who strongly thinks in European ways of thinking and of intellectual debate. And so with this Pope, the world's thoughts and the world intellectual debating culture comes into the Curia. And I think this is a very good, very massive change, yeah.
Martín Gak, this Pope, as an Argentine, has set out to make the Church a truly vital global institution, a big tent, as it were. Nonetheless, there are still some very significant disparities between Catholics, say, in Europe and the US versus Asia and Africa. Surveys show that in Asia and Africa, a large majority of Catholics agree with the conservative doctrines of the Church. The statistics are nearly exactly a mirror image the other way around if you ask Europeans and Americans. What does that mean for the future of this big tent he's trying to create?
I think if you really sort of are committed to the idea, if you're committed to the idea that the Church is a global organization, and I certainly am, I think that you need to bear in mind that the segmentation of its public will be actually extremely broad. So your problem is not only that you have, so for instance, there was a Univision study from a couple of days ago, I think, or a couple of weeks ago, showing that 75% of people in Asia and Africa think that couples who live together but are not married live in sin, whereas in Europe and the US, it's actually exactly the other way around. 75%, especially in Europe, think that this is actually fine. The problem, though, is that the people that are saying this kind of stuff, for instance, in the US, are most likely people that have economic commitments, economic policy commitments that align better to the right. Whereas the conservatives in social issues in Africa or in Asia, especially in very poor communities, are people that very likely in economic policy issues will align to the left. The interesting thing about this, if you think about sort of the global map, is that you really have a complete disaggregation of political alignment. The beauty of this is that, or the beauty of this political project in the Vatican now, is that there seems to be a capacity to read political priorities. And it seems to me that the political priority that has been identified is the lack of a center-left political agenda. So people seem to be willing to say, you know what? We've been talking about homosexuality, abortion, et cetera, but I cannot feed my children. But we're going out to the streets of Madrid, but we're going out to the streets of Venezuela, but we're going out to the streets of, just look anywhere and you will find something. So I think that the foresight here has really been about identifying political priorities.
If I understand all of you correctly, this culture of debate, this idea of a multiplicity of viewpoints, at least tolerating it, so to speak, is to be combined with what the Pope has called a culture of mercy, meaning an acceptance of the fact that people may not live by the doctrines that the Catholic Church professes, and nonetheless are welcome in the big tent. Martin, Derek Scully, would that go far enough to keep Europeans and Americans on board in a church that doesn't change doctrinally?
No, I'm quite pessimistic on that front. I think eventually he's going to be. I mean, it's to give an interview to Italian newspaper is one thing. To actually put out a doctrinal teaching is something else. And I think eventually, not the mask will fall. That sounds like there's something sinister behind that. But eventually, he will be nailed down. He will be forced to nail himself down doctrinally, and that I think is where the honeymoon will end. And people will say, oh, maybe it was just a media thing after all. He's a lovely man. Unfortunately, he's on a ship going in a direction, and I don't want to get on board that ship. So,
can I ask you? I mean, the following question. I mean, to me, I run the radical secular. So I clearly come from the camp that is not particularly committed to doctrinal positions. The Big Tent religiously might be interesting, and it might be an interesting question as to the Francis effect, brings more people into the church, makes more people more religious. All that is interesting enough. The question that to me is much more relevant is whether we do not actually are directly in front of the first build-up of a massive political tent. Forget the question of religion. I will never be a member of the church. I have already given up on my rabbi. I will not be a member of the church. But as an atheist, I remain committed to the idea that I can overlap political consensus with things that this man is saying, irrespective of what the religious position is. So I don't need his doctrinal change. What I need to see is what happens politically. And I actually have the impression...
Doesn't the church need a revitalization of faith in a very different sphere, quite apart from politics, in order to remain a living organism in the world of the 21st century?
My answer to that would be no. No, I don't think it does. I think that I think that there is sort of an overcommitment to ideas of religiosity. I think that when you have people that are in a state of crisis, you need something of this kind. When you have communities and countries which have more stable positions, there is a very different need.
Well, I'd have to disagree with Martin. I mean, if I was a politician and a bishop comes in and starts wagging his finger at me, I would say to him, why don't you sort out your own mess before you come in here lecturing me? And the church is particularly in Europe, is in a feeble position, or it's in a position of retrenchment. And although I agree that the Pope is perhaps the first globalized Pope touching on globalized issues that are affecting a global audience, I don't think the church is in a position at the moment. The lid is open on the hub, and he is tinkering with the engine. And unless that engine isn't working again, and the church becomes relevant, you cannot go in and start influencing political debate.
Shaking your head.
I would say, well, that Pope Francis has this aura and this power is because he's the head of this church, of this world church. And if this church is not able to revitalize its faith, then it will shrink and shrink and shrink, and somebody like the Pope won't have this power anymore in future.
Do you honestly think that
so
people...
this would not be... well, then he couldn't speak that powerfully in his political agenda either. So
I actually wonder, I mean, if we should really be persuaded by the idea that people are going to church precisely because they are committed to doctrinal or theological positions. As a matter of fact, I would tell you that most of the people that I know that go into churches have absolutely no idea about Christology or Trinitarian theology. And I would argue that these are actually central elements.
Are they really looking for political positions there, or are they looking for something else that's intuitive, that's emotional, that we often put under the name faith? I would not say that when we talk about politics, we're merely talking about party politics. When you have certain proclivities, when you see somebody who is poor or somebody who is suffering, this is actually a political commitment. It's a form of political...
He should be going after the floating voters. Is that what you're saying? People who don't want to commit.
No, I'm not saying he should go. I'm saying that he has already gone, and in many, many countries around the world, he has already captured them. So no, it's not that this is something that he should do. This is something that has already been happening under our nose for the last year, and I think that we see it in many
The definition of floating voters is you never captured them, you only rent them for a little while, and then they turn against you eventually.
But we shouldn't forget the fundament, why he's doing all that, why he's preaching in the way he's preaching. That is God, and that is his faith.
Claudia Keller, where we certainly have seen an immense enthusiasm and expansion of the Catholic Church that is in Africa and Asia. Could you imagine that in, say, 50 or 100 years, Catholicism might be largely a religion of those parts of the world?
Well, yes, I could imagine. I mean, in Africa and in Africa, isn't it already the most powerful religion? Catholicism? I think so.
I believe it is, yes.
Yeah.
Along with the evangelical Protestant movements.
Yes.
Could you imagine that Catholicism more or less disappears from Europe? Radical secularists, this is a society that's often referred to as post-Christian.
No, I don't think that it will completely disappear. No, there is this search in human beings for transcendence, for faith, for something that is higher than just ordinary life. And I don't think that this will disappear.
I actually would argue that if in Africa and in Asia, in the countries where you actually have really a strong presence of Catholicism, there is actually serious development in matters of health and technology over the last 20 years, we will see actually a dwindling of Christianity and religion in general. I don't think it will ever be complete.
But look at the US.
And look at a country like Ireland, Eric Scully. It saw a massive exodus from the Catholic Church after the abuse scandal. Where do you think Catholicism is going in your country?
Well, if you asked me 20 years ago today and in 20 years' time, 20 years ago I would have said it is in the DNA. It cannot be extracted. Now I look at it and it's going to be empty in 20 years' time. So it will dwindle and won't die. It will just retreat to perhaps the size it should always have had in the past.
And that despite the enthusiasm for a Pope Francis.
Indeed. I think let's talk in a year's time and see how much enthusiasm is left.
Yeah. We may well do that. Thank you so much for being with us today. And thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.